They came without warning. No negotiations, no threats, no demands, just an overwhelming force descending upon humanity's colonies like an unstoppable storm. The Yivath were the apex predators of the known galaxy, a civilization built on conquest, their physiology and technology making them seemingly invincible. Every world they invaded was reduced to cinders, every species they encountered wiped from existence. They had never lost a war, never even faced an enemy capable of slowing them down. To the rest of the galaxy, they were an unchallenged force of destruction. A species so advanced and so ruthless that surrender was considered the only rational response. And then, they met us. For the Yivath, humanity was just another insignificant species in the grand hierarchy of the cosmos, soft, fragile, and technologically primitive. To them, we were nothing more than another footnote in their long history of extermination. Their war fleets darkened human skies. Their shock troopers landed in the billions. Their war machines marched across our cities. They had studied our biology, our weaponry, our history. They had analyzed every war we had ever fought, every strategy we had ever devised, and deemed us weak, predictable, doomed. They had every reason to believe this. Their warships were generations ahead of ours. Their soldiers were bred for combat, engineered to be perfect warriors. Faster, stronger, and more resilient than anything humanity could field. Their weapons could turn entire cityscapes into smoldering wastelands in the blink of an eye. Their armored exoskeletons could withstand direct kinetic impacts, and their hive mind communication allowed them to function as a singular, flawless war machine. Every species they had encountered before had crumbled in days, some in hours. The invasion began as expected. The first planetary defense forces were obliterated within minutes. The Yivath's drop pods rained down in uncountable numbers, their biomechanical war engines crushing everything in their path. From orbit, their ships fired lance beams of pure energy, carving through buildings and fortifications as if they were made of paper. To the rest of the galaxy, watching from the shadows, it was just another inevitable massacre. Then something happened that the Yivath had never experienced before. Humanity didn't break. We didn't run. We didn't surrender. We fought back. The first battle lasted 37 minutes. That's all the time it took for the most feared warriors in the galaxy to realize they were not the apex predators anymore. The Yivath had always fought species that either submitted or shattered under pressure. But humans? We fought like nothing they had ever encountered. We adapted instantly. We didn't follow predictable strategies. We turned their own tactics against them. And most of all, we refused to die. At first, the Yivath were confused. Their enemies were supposed to break ranks, to scatter in terror, to surrender the moment defeat was certain. But human soldiers didn't run. They regrouped. They found weaknesses in the Yivath's seemingly perfect defenses. In real time, commanders in underground bunkers analyzed battle data and countered the Yivath with brutal efficiency. Entire regiments of enemy shock troops disappeared into city ruins, only to be systematically hunted down in ambushes that defied all logic. What should have been a swift planetary occupation became a nightmare of urban warfare. The Yivath had been trained to crush their opponents with superior numbers and overwhelming firepower. Humanity had been trained for something else entirely: asymmetric warfare, adaptability, and above all, survival at any cost. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles 849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. To understand why humanity won, you have to understand what made the Yivath so feared in the first place. Their biology alone made them seem unstoppable. Their bodies were covered in a dense, chitinous exoskeleton capable of absorbing bullets and shrapnel. Their muscles were fiber-reinforced, allowing them to move with terrifying speed and crush enemies with inhuman strength. Each of their warriors had redundant organ systems, meaning even catastrophic injuries weren't always lethal. And their nervous system was wired for instantaneous reaction times, allowing them to anticipate attacks before they happened. Even if one of them fell, their hive mind would instantly process the event and adapt, meaning that any tactic used against them once would never work again. But what they failed to understand, what every species in the galaxy failed to understand, was that humanity had spent its entire history preparing for something like this. We had fought wars not just for survival, but for ideology, for power, for territory, and sometimes for nothing more than vengeance. We had perfected the art of combat not just on battlefields, but in the darkest alleys, the most desolate landscapes, and even in the vast emptiness of space. Unlike the Yivath, we weren't bound by genetic programming or rigid tactical doctrines. We were chaotic, creative, and most of all, we were relentless. So when the Yivath descended upon humanity's first colony, expecting a swift and brutal victory, they instead found themselves facing an enemy that didn't fight for territory or resources, but for existence itself. And when a species fights with nothing left to lose, when they are backed into a corner with extinction as the only alternative, they become the most dangerous force in the universe. The Yivath had always seen themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, the natural apex predators of the universe. Every species they encountered had crumbled before them, their empires reduced to mere memories, their histories erased. Their invasions followed a precise and efficient pattern: eliminate planetary defenses, overwhelm ground forces, and establish absolute control within days. They had done it so many times that their war doctrine was practically automatic. But on humanity's first colony, something went wrong. It wasn't just that the humans resisted. It was how they resisted. The first cracks in the Yivath's confidence appeared when they faced the unexpected. Humans weren't stronger or faster, nor did they have superior technology. What they had was something far more dangerous: adaptability. The Yivath operated as a hive mind, processing battlefield information instantly and responding with perfect coordination. But they fought by predicting enemy behavior, using pre-existing strategies honed over centuries of conquest. That had always been enough. It had always worked. Until now. When they attacked our fortifications, we didn't defend them conventionally. Instead of fighting them head-on, we collapsed entire structures on their troops, turning the battlefield itself into a weapon. When they cut off retreat routes, human forces didn't retreat. They went underground, using sewer systems, abandoned tunnels, and ruins to set up ambushes. When the Yivath deployed their elite warriors, soldiers engineered to be immune to fear, fatigue, and injury, human snipers learned to target the weak points in their exoskeletons. And when the Yivath reinforced their armor against our initial weapons, humanity stopped relying on bullets altogether. We set entire districts ablaze, funneled them into kill zones where explosives and shrapnel turned their numbers into a liability. The Yivath's supreme confidence began to erode when their casualties kept rising. They weren't used to prolonged engagements. They weren't used to losing. For the first time in their history, their hive mind began to hesitate, struggling to make sense of an enemy that refused to break, that kept changing tactics, that turned every battlefield into a death trap. The psychological warfare was just as devastating. Human forces didn't just fight, they made the Yivath fear the fight itself. It started with subtle things. At first, the Yivath ignored the scattered human distress signals, assuming they were meaningless. But as time went on, they realized the transmissions weren't cries for help. They were bait, traps disguised as desperate pleas, luring their troops into ambushes. Then came the whispers. The Yivath communicated through their hive mind, their thoughts synchronized across vast distances. But human hackers, realizing the Yivath operated on organic frequencies, began broadcasting on those very wavelengths, filling their minds with static, with distorted human voices, with screams and laughter in alien languages. For the first time, the Yivath knew what it meant to be confused, to be uncertain. And then the real nightmare began. Humanity's military leaders quickly realized that direct engagements were costly. The Yivath were too strong, too numerous. A conventional war would be suicide. So humanity did what it did best. It changed the rules of the game. In every war before, the Yivath had fought opponents who followed predictable patterns, who relied on traditional tactics. But humanity understood something deeper. War wasn't about battles. It was about breaking your enemy's spirit. Instead of engaging in mass battles, human forces started striking in the dead of night. They didn't just kill the Yivath. They dismantled their entire sense of security. Yivath officers began disappearing, their bodies found days later, their exoskeletons shattered, their weapons missing. Elite units sent to eliminate human resistance were found torn apart, not by explosives or bullets, but by knives, blunt force, and sheer brutality. The Yevath, who had never known fear, began to experience something new: paranoia. Their war machines, once unstoppable, became liabilities. Engineers would enter maintenance bays to find their own vehicles sabotaged, entire engines missing, power cores drained. Their supply lines were no longer secure. Convoys vanished without a trace, warehouses exploded in brilliant fireballs. It didn't matter how many soldiers they sent. Every time they tried to push forward, they were met with a battlefield that had turned against them. The final blow to their confidence came when their own dead began to speak. At first, the Yevath assumed it was a technical glitch, an error in their hive mind network. But then the messages became clearer. Broadcasts in perfect Yevath dialect, warning them to leave, telling them the war was lost. The voices belonged to fallen warriors, their last thoughts captured and weaponized. The Yevath, who had once believed themselves immune to psychological warfare, began to experience something they had never felt before: doubt. Humanity wasn't just resisting. Humanity was hunting them. The war, which should have lasted mere hours, had stretched into days. The Yevath, who had never in their history faced a prolonged conflict, found themselves in an unfamiliar situation. They had come expecting a quick victory. Instead, they were trapped in a nightmare of endless skirmishes, ambushes, and sabotage. Their fleet commanders, once confident in their overwhelming firepower, began to struggle with a new problem. The enemy wasn't where they were supposed to be. The humans didn't fight like soldiers, they fought like ghosts. For the first time in recorded history, the Yevath war machine hesitated, and that hesitation was the beginning of their downfall. The Yevath had conquered hundreds of civilizations. They had turned entire species to dust, reducing once thriving empires to nothing more than fading echoes in the cosmic void. But in all their wars, in all their campaigns, they had never encountered anything like humanity. What had started as an invasion had become something far worse: an unrelenting war of attrition, a brutal contest where every second, every inch of ground, was paid for in blood. By the second week of the war, the Yevath realized something horrifying. They weren't winning. This wasn't supposed to happen. Humanity was supposed to collapse. The weight of the Yevath's numbers, technology, and superior biology should have ensured total victory. But instead of crumbling, humanity adapted. Instead of surrendering, we turned every battlefield into a death trap. And worst of all, we were getting better. For the Yevath, war had always been an equation, a precise formula: overwhelm the enemy, destroy their leadership, crush their will to fight. But humanity didn't follow the equation. We were chaos. We were unpredictable, and we had one advantage the Yevath never expected: our ability to learn. At first, human soldiers struggled against the Yevath's overwhelming physical superiority. One-on-one, a Yevath warrior could outmatch a human in raw strength, speed, and resilience. But humans weren't just fighters. We were thinkers. Every battle became an opportunity to study the enemy, to find weaknesses. Snipers learned to aim for the small gaps in their exoskeletons, where the chitin plates connected. Engineers developed explosives that weren't just powerful, but precise, designed to shatter the nerve clusters that coordinated the Yevath's movements. Medics discovered that Yevath warriors, despite their redundant organs, had a central processing lobe that controlled their hive-mind connection. Severing it didn't just kill them, it sent waves of confusion through their ranks. And then, humanity did something that no species had ever done before. We stole their technology and used it against them. At first, the Yevath assumed their weapons were too advanced for humans to replicate. After all, every species they had encountered before had struggled to even understand the basic principles behind their energy-based armaments. But humans? We didn't need decades of research. We just needed a few captured weapons, a handful of engineers, and sheer determination. In underground bunkers and makeshift labs, human scientists reverse-engineered Yevath weapons at a terrifying speed. Plasma rifles were stripped down and rebuilt with human modifications, making them more efficient and adaptable. Personal shielding, technology, once exclusive to Yevath elite warriors, was cracked and mass-produced for human soldiers. Even their communication networks were infiltrated, hacked by human cyber warfare specialists who turned their own hive mind into a vulnerability. The results were devastating. Y'Vath war councils began receiving false orders. Their troops were rerouted into ambushes. Their war machines were sabotaged from within. They had always believed their hive mind was an unbreakable advantage. Instead, it became their greatest weakness. But humanity didn't stop there. We knew that winning the battle wasn't enough. We had to break them. The psychological war escalated. The Y'Vath, who had once been the embodiment of terror, were now the ones experiencing it. Their elite warriors, once seen as unstoppable, began to falter as their enemies fought with inhuman resilience. Human soldiers didn't just fight to survive. They fought with a level of calculated brutality that defied all reason. Captured Y'Vath officers were interrogated with surgical precision, their knowledge extracted and used to dismantle entire battle strategies. And the worst part? Every failed attack, every lost soldier, every mistake they made was studied, learned from, and turned into the next nightmare they had to face. The breaking point came when humanity took the fight off-world. The Y'Vath had always relied on total orbital supremacy. Their fleets, massive and invincible, had crushed planetary defenses before ground battles even began. No species had ever successfully countered their planetary sieges. But humanity was different. We weren't just fighting to defend our worlds. We were preparing to take the war to theirs. In the dead of space, human pilots began striking back. At first, the Y'Vath dismissed them as nuisances, small, fast-moving strike teams that couldn't possibly threaten their massive warships. But they underestimated humanity's greatest strength, our ability to turn weakness into advantage. Human starfighters weren't the largest nor the most heavily armed, but they were fast, they were unpredictable, and they were piloted by warriors who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of aerial combat. While Y'Vath warships operated in flawless formations, human pilots moved with absolute chaos, darting between enemy fire, exploiting blind spots, and coordinating strikes that no artificial intelligence could predict. And then came the true turning point. Humanity unveiled its most dangerous weapon yet: boarding teams. The Y'Vath had never experienced direct combat inside their own ships. Their war doctrine was built on long-range superiority, on never allowing an enemy close enough to pose a threat. But humanity had other plans. Stealth insertion teams, equipped with stolen Y'Vath technology and customized human weaponry, began infiltrating enemy ships. Entire capital vessels went silent as small squads of human soldiers breached, their hulls cutting through corridors like vengeful ghosts. Y'Vath commanders, once accustomed to issuing orders from the safety of their flagships, now found themselves hunted in their own command centers. For the first time in their history, the Y'Vath were afraid. Humanity wasn't just resisting. Humanity wasn't just surviving. Humanity was winning, and the galaxy was watching. The galaxy had never seen anything like this. The Y'Vath, an empire that had once consumed entire civilizations without hesitation, was faltering. Across the void, alien species who had once feared them now watched in stunned silence as humanity, the newcomers, the supposed prey, dismantled their conquerors piece by piece. For the Y'Vath, this war had become a nightmare with no end. Their hive mind, once their greatest strength, was now their greatest vulnerability. It had allowed them to coordinate with flawless efficiency for centuries, but now it meant that every loss, every moment of fear, every fragment of doubt spread like a virus through their ranks. Humanity wasn't just killing them. We were eroding the very foundation of their species. It started subtly. Frontline commanders began hesitating before issuing orders, uncertain if their forces could execute them without running into another ambush. Elite warriors, once relentless in battle, started second-guessing their movements, their instincts tainted by the memories of comrades who had been slaughtered by unseen human snipers. Even their war beasts, bioengineered creatures designed to tear through enemy lines, began showing signs of fear, hesitating before charging, recoiling from the scent of human blood. But the real devastation came when humanity turned their own war doctrine against them. The Y'Vath had always relied on overwhelming firepower and absolute control of the battlefield. They believed that sheer numbers would crush any resistance, that no species could match their efficiency. But humanity had a different strategy. We didn't just fight them head-on. We waged total war. Infiltration units, now equipped with fully operational Y'avath cloaking technology, slipped past enemy lines and struck deep behind their front lines. Supply depots, once thought untouchable, were destroyed overnight. Entire communication hubs went dark, severing the connection between their fleets and ground forces. High-ranking Y'avath leaders, once safe in their fortified command centers, were found dead, killed by unseen assassins who had bypassed their impenetrable defenses. The Y'avath's war machine began to break down. Their soldiers, so reliant on a centralized command structure, became isolated and confused. Without orders from their commanders, they hesitated. Without reinforcements, they were slaughtered. Without the assurance of victory, they began to feel something they had never experienced before: despair. And humanity didn't stop. Psychological warfare escalated to unprecedented levels. Captured Y'avath ships were repurposed and used to sow confusion among their fleets. Human hackers embedded false commands into their communication networks, leading entire squadrons into ambushes. Y'avath war banners, once symbols of terror, were burned and replaced with human insignias on conquered worlds. And perhaps the most chilling act of all, humanity started broadcasting messages directly into their hive mind. They heard us in their thoughts. We whispered to them in their own language, mocking them, taunting them, reminding them that their empire was crumbling. We made them doubt their leaders, their gods, their own sense of superiority. We made them understand for the first time what it meant to feel hunted. And then, the executions began. The Y'avath had no concept of mercy. In every world they had conquered, they had wiped out resistance without hesitation. Civilians, soldiers, leaders, it didn't matter. They believed war was about total domination. So, humanity gave them a lesson in their own philosophy. Captured Y'avath commanders were publicly executed on live broadcasts, their last moments sent across enemy frequencies for every soldier in their empire to witness. High-ranking warlords were paraded through human-occupied territories, their armor shattered, their bodies weak and broken, before they were unceremoniously put down. Entire battalions of Y'avath prisoners, once the apex predators of the galaxy, were lined up and executed with ruthless efficiency, their remains left as a message to the survivors. This is what happens to those who challenge humanity. The brutality of it shook the galaxy. Other alien species, once terrified of the Y'avath, now found themselves terrified of us. This wasn't just a war. This was an extermination. The Y'avath's leadership, once unwavering in their belief that they were invincible, began to fracture. Some factions argued for retreat, believing that prolonged conflict with humanity was suicidal. Others refused to accept defeat, believing that if they could just regroup, just rally their remaining forces, they could still win. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The war was lost. The final act of defiance came when the Y'avath, in a desperate attempt to regain control, deployed their ultimate weapon, a planet killer. This was the weapon of last resort, a massive bioship designed to consume entire worlds in a matter of hours, stripping them of all life and converting their biomass into fuel for the Y'avath war effort. It was an apocalyptic weapon, one that had ended countless civilizations before. And they unleashed it on one of humanity's core colonies, believing that if they couldn't win the war, they could at least leave humanity crippled. They made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that, like every species before us, humanity would cower in the face of such overwhelming power. They assumed we would beg for mercy, that we would surrender rather than face total annihilation. But humanity never begged. Humanity never surrendered. Instead, we did the unthinkable. We boarded it, in a move that defied every military strategy. In existence, human forces launched a full-scale assault on the planet killer itself. Swarms of dropships, modified to bypass the bioship's external defenses, latched onto its hull like parasites. Breaching pods smashed through its organic armor, and human soldiers poured into the monstrous vessel, cutting through its defenses. With ruthless efficiency, The Yavath crew never stood a chance. They had expected resistance, but they hadn't expected an enemy willing to fight inside the very weapon meant to destroy them. They hadn't expected an enemy that would willingly charge into the belly of the beast, with no guarantee of escape, just to ensure its destruction. They hadn't expected us. The battle inside the planet killer was beyond brutal. The Yavath fought desperately, knowing that their last hope for victory was at stake. But they weren't fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting demons. Human forces carved a path straight to the ship's core, planting explosives in critical systems, rupturing its power supply, and overriding its controls. As the bioship's systems began to collapse, as its flesh-like structure started to burn from within, the remaining human soldiers barely managed to escape, watching from orbit as the weapon that was meant to end them was torn apart from the inside. The Yavath's ultimate weapon was gone. Their last chance at victory was obliterated. And with it, so was the last shred of their dominance. For the first time in history, the galaxy's deadliest species had lost. And humanity, we had just begun. The destruction of the Yavath's planet killer wasn't just a victory. It was a message. Declaration to the entire galaxy that humanity was unlike anything that had come before. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We weren't just pushing the Yavath back. We were proving a point. For centuries, the Yavath had been the apex predators of the cosmos, an unstoppable force that consumed all in its path. Their hive mind had made them cold, calculating, relentless. They didn't feel fear. They didn't hesitate. Every war they had fought had ended the same way, with total domination, until now. Because now, for the first time in their history, they weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. It started with the collapse of their front lines. The Yavath forces, already weakened by the loss of their commanders and supply chains, began to crumble under the weight of human counterattacks. Their fleets, once impenetrable juggernauts, found themselves overwhelmed by relentless human strikes. Their soldiers, once unshakable in battle, started breaking formation, something that had never happened before. They weren't just losing the war. They were losing themselves. Humanity, on the other hand, was evolving at an unprecedented rate. Our scientists, engineers, and military strategists had spent every second of this war learning, adapting, and improving. Captured Yavath technology, once an enigma, was now being mass-produced with terrifying efficiency. Our weapons had surpassed theirs. Our tactics had outgrown theirs. Our warriors, hardened by the fires of war, had become something even the Yavath couldn't comprehend. And now we were going on the offensive. For the first time in history, the Yavath were forced into retreat. They abandoned entire star systems, desperately trying to regroup. But it didn't matter. Humanity had cracked the code to their empire. Every Yavath-controlled world had the same weaknesses. Their reliance on hive mind communication, their central command hubs, their predictable supply chains. And one by one, those weaknesses were exploited. It wasn't enough to defeat them on the battlefield. Humanity wanted to break them completely. The psychological warfare that had begun as whispers in their hive mind escalated into full-blown terror campaigns. Yavath warriors would receive false orders, leading them into ambushes where they were slaughtered before they even realized they had been deceived. Entire fleets were turned against each other through hacked transmissions, resulting in friendly fire incidents that shattered their already fragile morale. And on every conquered Yavath world, humanity left a clear message, symbols carved into the ruins, written in their own language. You are not the apex predators anymore. The Yavath homeworlds were now within reach, and for the first time, the question wasn't whether humanity could defeat them, but whether we would allow them to exist. For the Yavath, surrender had never been an option. Their entire culture was built on dominance, on the belief that only the strong survived. But now, that belief was being tested in the most brutal way imaginable. Desperate, the last remnants of their leadership gathered in secret, discussing an option they had never considered before: peace. It was unthinkable. No species had ever forced the Yavath to negotiate. No species had ever made them question their own superiority. But now, they were on the verge of extinction, and they had no choice. A transmission was sent to the Human War Council, not a surrender, not yet, but an attempt to open negotiations. And humanity's response? Laughter. because we knew what they had done to every other species that had tried to negotiate in the past. We knew that the Yavath didn't understand diplomacy. They understood one thing and one thing only: power. So we gave them an answer in the only language they truly understood. The next attack wasn't just an assault, it was an execution. A Yavath stronghold, once believed to be impenetrable, was leveled in a single strike. Thousands of their warriors, their best and strongest, were wiped out in a matter of minutes. Their leadership, those who had dared to think they could bargain with humanity, were systematically eliminated, hunted down by infiltration teams who left no survivors. And then, we sent our message. No negotiations, no surrender, only extinction. The Yavath finally understood. This wasn't a war anymore. This was the end of them, and for the first time in their species' history, they ran. The once mighty Yavath Empire, the terror of the galaxy, collapsed in a way no one had thought possible. Entire fleets abandoned their posts. Entire colonies were left defenseless as their remaining warriors fled into deep space, desperate to escape the wrath of humanity. Their hive mind, once a symbol of perfect unity, shattered under the weight of fear and betrayal. Those who remained were hunted down, one by one, as human forces swept across their final strongholds. No mercy, no survivors, no second chances. Thorisy, Yavath, the galaxy's deadliest species, had challenged humanity, and they had lost. Instantly. But humanity wasn't finished. The galaxy had just witnessed the impossible, the fall of an empire that had once seemed unstoppable. And now, the question wasn't just what would happen to the Yavath. It was what we would become. Because in our victory, we had changed. We had become something else. And the rest of the galaxy was starting to wonder. Had they just traded one nightmare for another? The Yavath were gone. Their empire, once a monolithic force that had swallowed entire civilizations, was nothing more than scattered remnants. Isolated warships drifting in the void, abandoned fortresses overgrown with the skeletal remains of their former rulers, shattered colonies where the screams of their dying hive minds still echoed. But humanity. Humanity was still here, and the galaxy was watching. For years, every species that had once cowered under the Yavath's rule had prayed for salvation. They had dreamed of a day when their tormentors would be overthrown, when their chains would be broken, when they could finally be free. That day had come, but what followed was something none of them had expected. Because humanity didn't just defeat the Yavath, we annihilated them. Entire star systems, once teeming with Yavath forces, had been wiped clean. Their infrastructure had been dismantled, their history erased. Even their breeding worlds, their most sacred sites, the places where new generations of Yavath would have been born, were turned to dust. It wasn't just conquest, it was erasure. And the rest of the galaxy was terrified. The other alien species, those who had once cheered as humanity rose against the Yavath, now whispered in hushed voices. They had seen what we were capable of. They had watched as we waged a war unlike anything the universe had ever known. And they were beginning to wonder. Had they just replaced one unstoppable predator with another? At first, they tried to convince themselves that we were different, that humanity wasn't like the Yavath, that we wouldn't turn our weapons on them. After all, we had fought for survival. We had defended ourselves. Surely we wouldn't become conquerors. But then they saw what we did next. Humanity didn't stop at destroying the Yavath's military. We dismantled everything they had ever built. We took their weapons, their research, their technology, and we made it ours. The biological warships that had once terrorized the cosmos. Now they flew under human command. The advanced genetic warfare the Yavath had perfected, now it was in our laboratories. The terrifying hive mind that had once allowed them to coordinate with godlike precision. Now our scientists were studying it, adapting it, learning how to use it for our own purposes. We weren't just the victors of this war. We were evolving, and that was when the galaxy truly began to fear us. One by one, the surviving alien civilizations, the ones who had once been enslaved by the Yavath, sent emissaries to humanity, hoping to establish alliances, trade agreements, diplomatic ties. Some came out of gratitude, wanting to thank us for what we had done. Others came out of fear, desperate to prove that they were not our enemies. And how did we respond? We made them prove their loyalty. For centuries, these species had suffered under the Yivath. They had lost worlds, lost families, lost everything. And now, humanity gave them a choice. Stand with us, fight alongside us, prove that they were worthy allies, or stay out of our way. Some accepted, bending the knee without hesitation. They knew that resistance was pointless. They knew that if they refused, if they hesitated for even a moment, humanity could do to them what we had done to the Yivath. And so, they pledged their fleets to us. They gave us their strongest warriors, their greatest minds, their most valuable resources. They became a part of something greater, our empire, but others refused. They had watched what we had done. They had seen the cruelty of our war, the merciless precision with which we had exterminated an entire species. And they would not, allow themselves to be ruled by something even more terrifying than the Yivath. They tried to resist. They tried to stand against us. And they died screaming. Because humanity had learned something in this war. Something the Yivath had once believed about themselves. Mercy is a weakness. For every species that bent the knee, there was another that tried to flee, to hide, to rally against us. And one by one, they fell. Some of them had been allies once. Some had even fought beside us against the Yivath. But that didn't matter anymore. The war had changed us. There was no going back. The universe had been ruled by monsters for too long. First, it had been the Yivath. Now, it was us. And humanity had no intention of making the same mistakes they had. We weren't going to rule through fear. We weren't going to enslave. We weren't going to impose a hive mind. No, we were going to dominate through sheer supremacy. Our fleets became the largest the galaxy had ever seen. Our armies, bolstered by the technology we had stolen from the Yivath, were unstoppable. Our weapons, our defenses, our strategies, every single one was more advanced, more ruthless, more precise than anything that had ever existed. And so one by one, the galaxy fell in line. Some species swore loyalty out of fear, others out of admiration, some because they had no other choice. But in the end, it didn't matter why. Because the truth was clear. Humanity wasn't just another civilization. We weren't just another species. We were the end of an era. The question was no longer whether humanity would survive in this galaxy. The question was whether anyone else would. The war had ended. The Yivath, once the galaxy's deadliest species, had been erased from existence. Their name, their history, their very essence, gone. The stars they once ruled now belonged to us. The void that had once echoed with their hive mind's will was now silent. But for humanity, this was only the beginning. The galaxy was different now. The balance of power had shifted. Where once there had been fear of the Yivath, now there was something greater. Every species that had once trembled under their rule now lived under the shadow of something even more terrifying: us. At first, there was hope that humanity would stop, that after the war, after the bloodshed, after the annihilation, we would lay down our weapons, that we would return to the ways of diplomacy, to the alliances and treaties that had once defined interstellar relations. But those hopes were short-lived, because the truth was undeniable. We had changed. The war had forged us into something new, something unstoppable. The Yivath had believed they were the galaxy's apex predators, but in the end, they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated us, and in doing so, they had created something far worse than themselves. We had become the very thing the galaxy feared most. Not conquerors, not tyrants, not invaders. We had become the inevitable. The new order spread quickly. What had once been a chaotic, fractured galactic landscape was now being unified under a single power. Humanity did not ask for permission. We did not negotiate. We did not tolerate disobedience. We gave the galaxy a choice: stand with us, or be erased. Some species resisted. Some believed that if they stood together, they could defy us. That if they united, If they put aside their differences and formed an alliance, they could stop what was coming. They failed. Their fleets were torn apart, their armies scattered, their planets reduced to ash. For every species that dared to defy us, their names were stripped from the stars. The galaxy had seen what we had done to the Yivath. They had seen how quickly we had adapted, how effortlessly we had taken their technology, how we had turned their strengths into our weapons. And now, that same unstoppable force was turned on anyone who stood in our way. But the terrifying truth, we weren't driven by hatred. We weren't consumed by rage. We weren't mindless conquerors, enslaving for the sake of power. No, we were something worse. We were practical. We had seen what happens when the strong hesitate. We had seen what happens when civilizations are allowed to grow unchecked, when threats are ignored, when mercy is given to those who do not deserve it. The Yivath had taught us that lesson well, and we would not repeat history. We weren't ruling through terror. We weren't mindlessly destroying everything in our path. Instead, we built something greater. A system, a structure, a law. Every species that submitted to us was given a place within the new order, not as equals, not as sovereigns, but as cogs in a machine, efficient, controlled, perfect. Their civilizations were allowed to exist, but only under our terms. Their leaders were chosen by us. Their militaries were stripped down, their resources managed, their cultures reshaped, their histories rewritten. Because history, after all, is written by the victors, and humanity was the victor. The last remnants of resistance faded. The galaxy's final rebellions were crushed, and one by one, the stars fell under our dominion. It took years, decades, but eventually there was no more war. No more conflict, only order. And as humanity stood at the peak of the galaxy, looking down at the empire we had built, one final truth became clear. We had never been prey. We had never been the underdogs. We had never been weak. The Yivath had believed they were the deadliest species in the universe. They had believed they were the ultimate hunters, the perfect rulers, the most powerful force to ever exist. And in the end, they were just our first lesson. Because the real horror, the thing the galaxy was only just beginning to realize, was that this had never been about them. The Yivath were only the beginning. Humanity's war wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about vengeance. It was about something far bigger, something inevitable. Because we weren't just conquering the galaxy, we were claiming our rightful place at the top of it. And now, the universe knew the truth. The galaxy's deadliest species had challenged humanity, and they had lost, instantly. But this was only the beginning, because now, the rest of the universe had to wonder, who would be next?